Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our lecture series. I'm just going to stand over here. I'm Lisa Montoya, and I'm truly just so excited to see you here. The mask, by the way, is just a precaution. Yeah, it takes me back a moment to COVID. So again, my name is Lisa Montoya, and I'm Provost for Global Initiatives and Senior International Officer at UTSA. And it's my pleasure to welcome you. Feels a little loud, if we could adjust. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our series with the Colegio Nacional. And you can see the title here, Beyond Borders, Insights from Mexico's Colegio Nacional on Science, Culture, and Politics. This is an initiative of UTSA Research and UTSA Global Initiatives. Joanne Browning couldn't be here with us this evening. She had something with her family, and so she sends her regards and regrets that she couldn't join us. She did join us to welcome our guests last night. So we're honored to partner with the Colegio Nacional, which is a prestigious institution in Mexico dedicated to promoting the arts, sciences, and humanities. The Colegio brings together some of the most distinguished scholars and intellectuals in Mexico, and we are privileged to have two of their esteemed members lecturing tonight on linguistics and literature. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge just a few friends of the university and some leadership of the university as well. Raul Rodriguez Parrocio is a dear friend to UTSA. Thank you for being here, Raul. And then we have the deans of the College of Liberal and Fine Arts, Dr. Glenn Martinez. We have the dean of co-ed, the College of Education and Human Development, Mario Torres. Thank you for being here, Mario Torres. Let's see, we have the chair of Bicultural and Bilingual Education Studies, Patricia Sanchez. Thank you for being here. And thank you to everyone. And we have Dr. Lupita Carmona here, who is the executive director of Context, an office that is connected to the UT system, as well as CONACYT in Mexico. Thank you for being here, Dr. Carmona. So, to introduce our guest this evening, we have a colleague who isn't always here. We have Dr. Sergio Alcocer, who's a professor at UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, but he's also a professor here at UTSA, and he's on sabbatical from UNAM, and so he's here with us, and we're really excited. And so when Sergio came, and I'm just gonna depart from my notes here, when Sergio came, he had this wonderful idea. Why don't we bring some speakers from the Colegio Nacional? Let's see what we can do together. And so we said, yes, this is a great opportunity. We want to do this with you. I will also say that Sergio has connected us to other partners in Mexico, and for that we're very grateful. If you don't know Dr. Sergio Alcocer, I will have to consult my notes a little bit for this. If you don't know him, he's an engineer by training, civil engineer. But he does a lot of other things in terms of politics and policy and government. He served as the president of COMEXI, which is the equivalent in Mexico of the Council on Foreign Relations here in the U.S. You might have seen publications of CFR, and they do, gosh, even more publications in Mexico at COMEXI. He's also held prominent positions in the federal government of Mexico, including Under Secretary for Strategic Planning in the Ministry of Energy, and Undersecretary for North America in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so again, when Dr. Alcocer said, let's try and do this, we were so excited, and we are so pleased that it's come to fruition this evening with all of you here. Sergio, it's a privilege to have you here at UTSA, and I pass the baton to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much for your very kind introduction. And let me just start a little bit with some explanation why this seminar is, for me, so important. And for all of us, I think it's very important. Mexico and the United States share one of the most dynamic and diverse relations, yet very complex. Everyday personal exchanges, whether for family or work reasons, and trade and co-production of hundreds of products take place in a continuous fashion. But also, there are tensions and grievances on immigration, flow of arms, drug production, and trafficking that complement our relation. So this seminar, suitably called Beyond Borders, Insights from Mexico's El Colegio Nacional on Science, Culture, and Politics, is a testimony of what soft diplomacy can do. That is to show our own peoples, ourselves, convince ourselves that our great nations can talk, think, explore, research, and discover together for our shared prosperity. So thank you very much for El Colegio Nacional, and in this case, Dr. Lara and Christopher Dominguez, for being here, and also, of course, to UTSA for accepting the challenge of moving our peoples more, moving them together and have this exchange of ideas. To introduce our first speaker, let me just say that Spanish is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world, with approximately 496 million native speakers and almost 600 million total speakers. Remarkably, Mexico boasts the largest number of native Spanish speakers in the world, with around 220 some, almost 130 million people speaking Spanish as the first language. So our first lecture is going to deal with the modern Mexican Spanish, which will be presented by esteemed linguist Luis Fernando Lara. Luis Fernando Lara is a renowned linguist and lexicographer, known for his extensive work on the Spanish language in Mexico. He has been a pivotal figure at El Colegio de México, where he is an emeritus professor, and he has contributed significantly to the field of linguistics in Mexico, leading the project of the Diccionario del Español de México, the Spanish dictionary of the Spanish spoken in Mexico. And so he will be speaking about modern Spanish in Mexico. Thank you very much, Dr. Lara. And thank you. The microphone is yours.
Thank you. On the contrary, I feel honored with this invitation, and I want to thank the University of Texas in San Antonio and especially Dr. Sergio Alcocer for the invitation. Several years ago, among linguists, we used to tell a joke about the famous Russian linguist Roman Jakobson. It was said that he spoke Russian very well in 11 different languages. To proporción garde, I would say that I speak Spanish very well in English. The well-known Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset wrote once, "Whoever wants to see the times in which he lives must look at them from afar." And this is the sense of my lecture. What do we mean when we say modern Mexican Spanish? What do we mean when we say Mexican Spanish? And what does the word modern means related to Mexican Spanish? I will develop answers to these questions, offering a panorama of the history of Spanish in what we call now Mexico, considering, please, this is the index of what I am going to expose. As it is well known, the Spanish language began spreading in our continent at the beginning of the 16th century. There are enough documents that prove the initial characteristics of Spanish in New Spain. The primary current of Spanish settlers was of Andalusian and Extremeño origin. Their Castilian language was in the middle of a change, the well-known phonological revolution of the golden centuries, between the end of the 15th and the 17th century. I will not focus on the characteristics of such a change, which maybe you already know. For those interested in it, you can read it in several books. For instance, Rafael Lapeza's canonical Historia de la Lengua Española, or my Historia Mínima de la Lengua Española. In English, Ralph Penny's A History of the Spanish Language. I will only refer to three significant results of such a change in Andalusia and Extremadura, and then in our continent. First, the indistinction between S, fricative dental or alveolar, well known as ceseo, and Castilian fricative interdental th. Second, related to the first distinction, the pronunciation of S as a dental phoneme instead of the Castilian alveolar. In third place, the loss of distinction between lateral palatal L and Y central palatal fricative. These changes characterize what we can call American Spanish, or, following Diego Catalan's proposal, Atlantic Spanish. The role of the Aboriginal population has been generally neglected in the history of Spanish. We have to take into account that 500 Spaniards, those who arrived with Hernán Cortés, the conqueror of Mexico, confronted with several millions of indigenous people in Mesoamerica, could not have been able to conquest and hold their dominion in the whole region, and especially in the Nahuatl-speaking dominions, central Mexico, without the collaboration of local population. Hernán Cortés was cunning enough as to begin the conquest by making alliances, first with Tlaxcala and Tlatoque, the Nahuatl plural of Tlatoani, caciques or lords, then with almost every Altepetl, cacicazgo or lordship in the whole Mesoamerica. Another element of that decisive role of indigenous people in the imposition of Spanish was the immediate marriage or concubinage of Spaniards and indigenous women. Already the first generation of children of Spaniards and indigenous women, around 1530, became the Spanish language as their mother tongue, even if it was really its father's tongue. Those children were admitted as legitimate within the father's house, and therefore Spanish became their tongue. But also those excluded from that recognition, those illegitimate or bastard, needed to adapt to the growing Spanish society instead to keep their mother's language, since it was Spanish, the language which could insert them in the newly dominant society. As Aboriginal population in Mesoamerica suffered during the first colonial century a decrease from 25 to only 1 million in 1605, the number of hybrids or mestizos grew continuously. Spanish spread proportionally. As the indigenous population began to diminish, the need for labor force in the mines, the sugarcane cultivations, and in the Spaniards' household promoted the acquisition of African slaves. Those slaves were discriminated but not kept in isolation. Therefore, Spanish became the only language with which they could communicate with the Spanish-speaking society and also among each other, since they spoke several different African languages like Wolof, Kikongo, and Kimbundu. In addition, according to colonial laws, which acknowledge the rights of indigenous people, it was an important part of the negotiation with Aboriginal lordships. When an African man married an indigenous woman, their children were free as their mothers. The lowlands of the Gulf of Mexico's coast were rapidly dedicated mainly to sugarcane plantations. So African slaves became the majority of the population in those regions. Colonized by Andalusians and Extremeños, the language slaves learned had an Andalusian shape, and even today in Veracruz. Colonization began in Mexico City, not at the coast of Veracruz. From this old Mexica capital city, different colonizing expeditions were spread. it is necessary to notice that those expeditions were not at random. They followed routes and pathways already known and even mapped by the Indians, as you can see in this map. To the west, Nuño de Guzmán founded the city of Guadalajara and the region of Nueva Galicia, which extended toward the center north of Mexico. South of Nueva Galicia, Purépecha or Tarasco Kingdom was a Cortés conquest, actual Michoacán and part of Guerrero. To the south, first of all, Cortés' expedition towards Honduras failed, but later Francisco de Montejo and his descendants conquered actual Campeche and Yucatán. Pedro de Alvarado conquered Chiapas and Guatemala. To the north of Mesoamerica, there were three different routes. The main one went from Mexico City toward Querétaro, Guanajuato, Zacatecas, to the inner side of Sierra Madre Occidental, Chihuahua, and finished in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, New Mexico, the so-called Camino de Tierra Adentro. Along the Pacific coast, even if Nuño de Guzmán proceeded to Nayarit and south of Sinaloa, it was Franciscan and later Jesuitic missionaries who established the Spanish colony up to Los Angeles and San Francisco during the 17th and 18th centuries. Colonization of northeastern New Spain came later mainly in Coahuila, whose ranch produced food for the miners in Camino de Tierra Adentro. During the 18th century, finally, Nuevo León was populated at the beginning by a scarce Sephardic immigration. All colonizing expeditions were composed of a few Spanish leaders, some missionaries, and mainly, and this is important, mainly Tlaxcalan and Mexicas together with Africans. The role of indigenous languages, Nahuatl in the first place, in every region was important. It is a matter of discussion how much it has influenced Mexican Spanish. In phonetics, reinforcing ceseo and neutralization of the distinction between el and ye, yeísmo, introducing the phonetic ability to pronounce Nahuatl phoneme tl, as in Xochitl, for example, Xochitl means flower, for example, among other features. We have to consider the rich consonantic character of Nahuatl as opposed to Andalusian vocalism. Andalusian phonetics, which delete S at final syllables followed by consonant, or at the end of a word like gusto, gusto, cosa, cosas, or deletion of intervocalic D in pescado, pescado, disappeared in central Mexico, but kept at the Gulf Coast even today. In morphology, since the structure of all Amerindian languages was totally different from Spanish, only a few Nahuatl suffixes like ica, eca, to build ethnonyms or demonyms entered Spanish, as in Mexica, Tolteca, Mixteca, or at the beginning, and this is very nice, Castilteca, to name Spaniards, Castilteca, Castellano. Nowadays, in Chiapas, every foreign person is to be called Caxlan, also coming from Castellano. An interesting case of influence to build adjectives, mainly in Nueva Galicia, is the suffix che, in Tololoche, Pedinche, Ablinche, Llorinche. There has been a long discussion, not yet resolved, of the old hypothesis that this suffix proceeds of the Coca language, supposedly part of the Uto-Nahuatl family. The vocabulary of Amerindian origin is enormous, mainly to name animals, plants, food and cooking, agricultural procedures, family relationships, etc. In each and every Mexican region, we notice all these differences. The amount of African influence on Mexican Spanish is still to be studied due to the difficulty of finding descriptions and vocabularies of those languages during the 16th and 17th centuries. Nevertheless, words like marimba, cachimba, mucama, mocambo, and even sentir cuscús, I don't know if Mexicans know that expression to feel fear, sentir cuscús. And the well-known chingar have African origin. Research on varieties of Spanish in Mexico has been rather difficult. We depend on documents from the Inquisition archive, now kept in the General National Archive, Archivo General de la Nación, in Mexico City, and on documents conserved in some churches, especially cathedrals, to have some idea of the evolution of Spanish in Mexico during colonial times. Those texts are written by notaries with an orthography that does not reveal phonetic differences. Syntax and vocabulary correspond to the legal style. Only, for instance, some prohibited songs attached to the inquisitorial trial records with the real morphology, syntax, and vocabulary seem to give us a taste of regional and popular Spanish in Mexico. But we still cannot infer a map of regional variation from them. As you saw, I have been exposing only New Galicia because it seems to be a region that holds even now, and of course Yucatan. But this is all what I can suppose of the colonial times. After the appearance of the press, mainly in the 18th century, we can notice some differences among Mexican Spanish regions. At the end of that century, writers like José Antonio de Lizardi, El Periquillo Sarmiento, began to try to reflect popular Mexican Spanish, especially of Mexico City, where he was born. After the independence, some writers and also the press showed interest on these differences. For instance, Manuel Paino, autor of Los Bandidos de Río Frío, or Guillermo Prieto, Viajes de Orden Suprema, and Musa Callejera, among them. Those writers aimed to create an original Mexican literature. Nevertheless, except for some differences in vocabulary and some traditional idioms, their language does not differ from the Spanish cultivated tradition. Independence did not mean a break within the Spanish verbal tradition. The Mexican first governments after the independence were marked by the struggle between those who tried to keep the centralistic organization of the country, following colonial structures and culture, with the important role of the Catholic Church, which were named conservatives, and those who tried to impose a federalist and secularist definition of the country, named liberals. Important for our history of Mexican Spanish is that conservatives also tried to keep Mexican Spanish as close as possible to the metropolitan language, represented by the Royal Spanish Language Academy. They, as everywhere in Spanish America, were afraid that, since the independence could imply a strong distancing from Spain, language would evolve into several different languages, unintelligible among them, as was the case with the evolution of Latin to Romance languages. That idea resulted in the appearance and reinforcement of what I call suspicion of deviation of Mexican Spanish, that we were always using an incorrect form of language. The creation of the corresponding Mexican Language Academy in 1871 aimed to correct the language usages of Mexicans following metropolitan Spanish use, deepening that suspicion of incorrectness. Nevertheless, some works like the Idiotismos hispano-mexicanos by Melchor Ocampo, or Garciecas Balsetas, Vocabulario de Mexicanismos, aim to describe Mexican particular usages of Spanish. This lack of studies of our language during the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century may have had another reason. Linguistics, as a science, with its descriptive interest, developed everywhere late in the 19th century. Therefore, there was neither an objective spirit to pursue such interests, nor the necessary research methods. Professor Juan López Blanch at el Colegio de México directed our first general survey of Spanish in Mexico. Between 1960 and 70, he conducted his students, me among them, in a general study of regional Mexican Spanish, later published as Atlas Lingüístico de México. His aim was merely to define provisionally regional boundaries, dialects of Spanish in Mexico, compared with experiences already existing in Spain, especially in Andalusia, Colombia, and some other Romance language countries. This research offered us a provisional delimitation of Mexican Spanish in 16 dialectal zones, as you can see in the slide. Some of these regions, like the one López Blanch named Occidente, seem to correspond to all Nueva Galicia. Yucatan has a clearly distinct personality thanks to the still normal bilingualism Maya Spanish. López Blanch divides North Mexico into 3 different regions. Northwest, approximately Sinaloa, Sonora, and Baja California. North, Chihuahua and Coahuila. And Northeast, Nuevo León and Tamaulipas. Nevertheless, those dialectal boundaries, established mainly by phonetic differences, still need further research. Today, 50 years later, it is possible that regional varieties are losing their original differences in a constant process of standardization toward a national Mexican Spanish. During colonial times, even if language policies were always oriented at teaching Spanish to indigenous people, this native population was greater than that of mestizos and Europeans, and their languages were used everywhere. There was a general state of multilingualism. According to the first national census in 1790, and estimations of Hugo Castro Aranda's publication of that census, Censo de Revillagigedo, 60% of Mexican population were indigenous. 40% of Mexican population had Spanish as mother tongue. In spite of that, for Mexican politicians, after the independence, mainly during the 19th century and the first quarter of 20th century, Mexico needed only one national language to reach its necessary unity. Amerindian languages ought to disappear. An important and wrong decision of Mexican governments was to obliterate the category of Indians in all government policies, and to consider them only as Mexicans in poverty. Since then, all Mexican censuses have failed to recognize with precision the amount of indigenous people, the surviving of their languages, and the growing of bilingualism with Spanish. According to the recent census of 2020, only 7% of Mexicans are indigenous, but there is not a measure of bilingualism. Efforts to offer elementary education in Amerindian languages are still scarce, sometimes even only simulated, not to say to recognize the human right to their mother tongue, with all political and cultural consequences. It was therefore independent Mexico which finally considered Spanish as our national language, Mexican Spanish. At the beginning of the 18th century, when the French Bourbon dynasty ascended the throne in Spain, there was a profound reorganization of government and economy in the Spanish Empire. It was an ancient tradition to respect historical kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, like León, Aragon, or Navarra. New Spain was also considered a kingdom, comparatively equal to the others, with its own legal rights, established precisely to acknowledge the special privileges of indigenous population, Spanish settlers and their Mexican children. Contrary to this tradition, the Bourbon dynasty considered all viceroyalties of America mere colonies, French style. Indigenous people lost legal recognition. Spanish was, for the first time, obligatory for all inhabitants of Mexico. New Spain's economy was even more strongly submitted to the economy of Spain. As a result of these changes, a general protest against them arose among Spaniards settled and already born in Mexico, the so-called criollos, and native population. Especially some well-educated people, like the Jesuit Francisco Javier Clavijero, undertook the study of Mexican or Aztec history and culture. The result of these studies was to argue that the old Aztec kingdom ought to be considered the glorious and legitimate origin of Mexico, and that it should not be treated as a mere colony. Clavijero's work, among some others of the same theme, turned out to be an important ideological basis for the independence of Mexico, as shown by Luis Villoro's book, member of el Colegio Nacional, El proceso ideológico de la Revolución de Independencia. This ideological elaboration became decisive importance after the Mexican Revolution, with its vindication of Indian past as shown almost everywhere in monuments and paintings all around the country. But its consequence was the denial of the Spanish inheritance, and with it, the paradoxical ideological denial of the Spanish language as part of our nationality. Even more paradoxical was the effort to force indigenous people to learn Spanish under the consideration that Mexico ought to have, I quote, one people, one unified language, and one national soul. So, for the independent Mexico, Spanish is our national language, but due to our indigenistic ideology, some Mexicans consider Spanish only as a borrowed language, even if it is their mother tongue, and they do not speak Nahuatl nor any other Indian language. If we add this kind of ideological schizophrenia to the already mentioned suspicion of deviation, we can also understand why some Mexicans tend to distrust their own verbal traditions of Spanish, reinforcing the dependence of normative decisions of the Royal Spanish Academy. Nevertheless, the fact is that today Spanish is the mother tongue of around 120 million persons, the biggest Spanish-speaking community in the world. Mexico City's role in the standardization of our language has been growing during 5 centuries, due to its centralistic political power, to national educational programs, to the evolution from a peasant to an industrial society, to the constant immigration from the country to the cities, and to the increase of national communication networks, highways, telephone, internet, and the powerful influence of radio and television. This role of Mexico City in the evolution and standardization of our Spanish results in the constant loss of dialectal differences, even if phonetics and vocabulary still show important differences, as you may easily find out when you compare, for instance, pronunciation in Nuevo León, in Jalisco, in Yucatan, and in Mexico City. As for vocabulary, especially the press and television, tend to adopt our standardized vocabulary, but sometimes in local journals and radio stations, we still find local words and idioms. Mexican writers are a rich source of data to know and value our Mexican-Spanish regional varieties. As I said before, Mexican literature and press have always kept the relationship between our cultivated language tradition, shared with all Spanish-speaking territories in the world, but with, let us say, a Mexican taste, not only in themes, but in style, and a relationship with Mexican dialect. That is a mutual enrichment between the cultivated language tradition and the regional language traditions. Mexican Spanish is the result of this continual interaction. French linguist Josette Redeboeuf proposed about 50 years ago that the contemporaneity of a language could be defined by the sharing of ways of speaking, usual syntactical patterns and vocabulary of at least 3 generations of speakers living at the same time. That is what Redeboeuf called a practical synchrony. If we compare Mexican Spanish from the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th with today's language, we notice important differences in style, in the many ways to articulate a newspaper or a novel text, and also in vocabulary. But that does not mean that we cannot read works or press of the 2 past centuries. We could say that modern Mexican Spanish is the language we use from the second quarter of the 20th century up to now, the language of grandparents, parents, and children. We can define modern Mexican Spanish as the common standard language used in all Mexican regions, spread historically from Mexico City through public education, the legal system, newspapers, radio and television, journals, movies, etc. Modern Mexican Spanish is the standardized form of our cultivated verbal tradition. In phonetics, it is the pronunciation of Mexico City which imposes itself through uses all around the country, as we can notice, for instance, in television news programs, when the speakers try to adopt this pronunciation of accent, sometimes even contrary to the phonetics of their own region. In morphology, I will cite just a few examples. Construction of diminutive flexions of nouns and adjectives with the suffix ito, chiquito, blandito, manita, piecito, niñita. As is well known in Mexico, it is quite common, even characteristic, the use of this diminutive suffix as the expression of courtesy. ¿Me pasa por favor la salecita? Me tardaré un minutito. Or, in the case of a seller woman in a market, I was present then, saying to an enormous man, marchantito, no se vaya a ensuciar sus manitas. The adverb ahorita is still considered typical of Mexican Spanish, even if it has spread towards Central America. For augmentatives, we use suffixes ote, ota, and aso, asa. When using the first one, we mean only size or volume, grandote, fuertota, casota. We use the second one to express great force of an action, golpazo, pleitazo, madrazo, zapotazo. There is preference for the verbal suffix ada in paseada, platicada, but also isa, correteada, corretiza, madreada, madriza. We use superlative prefixes re or rete to build re bonito, re feo, rete caro, and even requete lejos. Since several years ago, before feminist political correctness, in Mexico it is normal to use masculine and feminine suffixes like el jefe, la jefa, el juez, la jueza, el ministro, la ministra. Nowadays we begin to listen la miembra. We use exhortative particle le as an imperative verbal suffix. Ándale, córrele, apúrale. The famous anthropologist Alfredo López Austin proposes that this particle has been detached from an exhortative one in Nahuatl, Axcali, already adapted in Mexican Spanish since centuries ago as Axcale, by an allogical segmentation of syllable le. If this is true, it has nothing to do with the homonymous dative personal pronoun le. Mexican Spanish preserves the etymological distinction between third-person accusative pronouns lo, la, in phrases like lo vi ayer, la vi ayer, deseo invitarlo a comer, deseo invitarla a comer, contrary to the usage in Spain, le vi ayer, deseo invitarle a comer, for both genders. I must notice in this case that influence of the Spanish press and maybe political correctness are imposing in Mexico the peninsular Spanish usage. There is an interesting case of a development of a discontinuous morpheme. This is something we had never seen in Spanish, se, es. For example, in academic correctness, there is no difference in a sentence like se lo di when the dative is singular or plural. Di un libro a Antonio, singular, se lo di. Di un libro a mis amigos, plural, se lo di. In Mexican Spanish, and apparently already spread into other Spanish dialects, we say in this last case, se los di, attaching plural es to the accusative pronoun. It has been some kind of a scandal for the Spanish Academy. We use a preposition a with verbs like entrar, introducirse, meterse. Entrar a la casa, introducirse a una conversación, meterse al agua. It is normal to build exclamative constructions with como plus adjective. ¿Cómo eres cruel, mano? ¿Cómo es linda esa muchacha? Also, it is completely common to say, se me hace, it seems to me. Se me hace que va a llover. We say, ¿qué tanto? Instead of cuánto. ¿Qué tanto pesa ese costal? Our beloved form, disque, negative or dubitative. Disque sabe mucho. Disque mañana llega. Also, the temporal expression de que instead of the adverb cuando. Inherited from Golden Age Spanish. De que a mí se me mete una idea, no me la saco de la cabeza. Differences in vocabulary are great among every Spanish-speaking countries as a result of necessary adaptation to their historical experiences. Up to now, unfortunately, the Spanish Academy has tried to cope with these differences in one dictionary, the Diccionario de Americanismos. Information in this dictionary depends on the work of each national language academy, which usually work with unclear methodologies to produce their dictionaries of localisms. In the case of Mexico, the Diccionario de Mexicanismos. Today, Mexico and Argentina are the only Spanish-speaking countries in Spanish America which have its own integral and original dictionary. The Diccionario del Español de México, created and directed by me at el Colegio de México, and the Diccionario Integral del Español de Argentina. This is the printed version, and this is the online version. The online version is free. When we analyze our dictionary, we notice a lot of differences in form and meaning as compared with the vocabulary of the Dictionary of the Spanish Academy. I invite you to read our dictionary and to discover thousands of differences, mainly in meaning and usage. Popular Mexican Spanish is rich in the different regions and in the national standard. I will not deal now with it, but you can search it in our dictionary under the mark popular and or in each region. As has been happening in the most part of the world, American English and American habits have great influence in our Spanish, not only in the case of scientific and technical vocabulary, but also in everyday life. Some examples: bye instead of adiós. Le aprecio mucho su ayuda instead of le agradezco su ayuda. Aplicar para un trabajo instead of solicitar un trabajo. Espero por ti instead of te espero. Outfit instead of atuendo. Look instead of apariencia. Boobie instead of seno, teta or chichi. Casting instead of elenco. Family room instead of estancia or sala de estar. Nearshoring instead of relocalización. Outsourcing instead of tercerización, and many other cases. As it has been recently recognized by the Spanish Academy, the Spanish language is a polycentric language. I would say that happens also with English. That means that being the national language of 21 countries, in each of them Spanish has its own characteristics and spreads a national variant. But what the Spanish Academy does not notice is that the broadcasting power of national variants is different among them. That means that Spanish is also a multipolar language. We can define the important poles of expansion of Spanish not only because of their population amount, but mainly because of the power of their communication networks. In this sense, I consider as main poles of Spanish Spain, Mexico, Argentina, and Colombia. For instance, editorial production in Spain is equivalent to the editorial production in all Spanish America. In this continent, Argentina and Mexico are the main editorial producers. I have not found good data about television programs production and exportation. It seems that Mexican and Colombian television producers are the main exporters. A very complicated case is the one of translation to Spanish from foreign languages, mainly English, but also French, Italian, and German. Literary and human science texts are usually translated to the shared, cultivated tradition of Spanish, and therefore national dialects hardly show in them. This is not the case of entertainment novels, bestsellers, television series, and films, where dialectal and popular variation cannot have a correspondence in Spanish. Therefore, there are two possibilities of translation: either to popular verbal traditions in each Spanish-speaking regions, and then it would be needed at least 21 different versions, or to search forms in Spanish that do not correspond to any popular variant, but to cultivated tradition with enough footnotes to explain the differences. In the case of television programs or series and films, either dubbed or with subtitles, we notice the same problem: which vocabulary to use and which pronunciation. My colleague at el Colegio de México, Raúl Ávila, made an interesting study of pronunciation in Spanish America. He proposes that Mexico City and Bogotá pronunciations are the clearest and most commendable for such translations. Well, this is the panorama of modern Mexican Spanish. I hope to have imposed some questions, because this is not yet solved, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lara, for this enlightening lecture. I think it's, oh, there it is. So now the floor is open for questions. Please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. And at the same time, we're going to be preparing for the next lecture that will be in Spanish. So anybody who needs a piece for translation, please raise el puño. So let's do that. So hand for questions and puño for the earpiece translation. Sweet. Thank you. I mean, we have to turn it on. This is on. Questions? Yeah. Questions? Perfect. There. Okay, and then this is yours.
No questions.
Para contestar. There.
I was just curious about disque, and if you know if it's disque coming from disque, like ironically, or si es irónicamente, porque.
Please, could you speak a little harder?
Okay. I was curious about disque and the origin and etymology of disque, if it comes from disque or if it comes from something else.
Yes, I think disque is a transformation of disque, but the meaning now is completely different. We can find that form already since the 19th century. When you analyze, for instance, Lizardi's work, you can find a lot of ways of speaking completely actual in Mexico that were already used in Mexico at the beginning of the 19th century. I think a lot of aspects of Mexican Spanish today has a very long tradition from the beginning of the colonial times.
Thank you.
I have a question here.
Hi, thank you for such an interesting talk. I wanted to see if you could elaborate a little bit on the how can we support this idea that Mexican Spanish may be losing diversity from the perspective, which I think could be one of the ideas that you mentioned there, from the perspective of the regional dialects. Do we have any, did you do any more recent studies similar to the Lope Blanche showing how the dialects, the regions now speak more similarly between them, or what is the type of data that now we can mention as that is evidence that we know today it's becoming less diverse, or yeah?
I don't know if I understood you well, but as I said, this research by Lope Blanche, Atlas Lingüístico de México, gave us a lot of information, mainly about phonetics, and this is an advantage, because phonetics is a kind of data in which you can confide, because this is the pronunciation is not conscious. You have to look at your pronunciation if you want to change your pronunciation. Otherwise, you speak just like that. So all these phonetic data are very good to recognize different dialects. This is not the case with vocabulary, because vocabulary is not precisely related to the regions in the same way. For instance, I have been coming to the idea that the differences Lope Blanche found between Northwest, Occidental, and Southern Pacific might be, in some cases, only one region, as we can see in our dictionary. But unfortunately, the vocabulary of the Atlas Lingüístico de México is very small. It's about 1,400 forms. So we cannot reach a good hypothesis about this. I have been hoping that state universities all around the country make their own research, because we have no money, we are very few, so as to make we from Mexico City a research in the whole territory. So I was hoping that they make their own research. That would be great. Up to now, that is the case of Sinaloa. There's a study already on Spanish of Sinaloa. In Zacatecas, they are beginning to make their research. But, excuse me, I forgot to cancel this. But unfortunately, not in the other parts of the country. So we cannot yet say precisely which are the differences. There are, but we are not sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this. This is a great talk. It's been really good. I have a quick question about the English that you see mixing into the Spanish, and whether you see that English in specific areas, such as in urban areas, happening more, and whether or not that English that's mixing into the Spanish is a way for people from urban areas to separate themselves from the people in the rural areas.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, of course, English has a more profound influence in technical vocabularies, mainly of modern engineering, computation, and so on. Also in ways of living. In Mexico, especially in two social classes, the upper social class and the lower social class are very Americanized. So this is a way of living, and they are learning continually. If you read Mexican newspapers, when they speak about fashion, you are going to find a lot of English words. Not pronounced as they should, as my pronunciation, of course, but there are these also among young people. What they see in Instagram and Facebook and so on influences immediately on them. For instance, I didn't know up until 3 weeks ago what meant the expression "lol." I had no idea. One of my grandchildren explained me, and we see that completely. So. In Mexico, there has been always a puristic tradition, and they try to go against English influence. This is impossible. We have to consider that so is the way of living today, and we have to cope with that. If you see our dictionary, there is a lot of English words defined in Mexico, and sometimes with different meaning. But the influence is there, and it is going to last for a while.
Could you pass it to me, please?
So, leaving aside the recent influx of English in Mexican Spanish or in Spanish in general, what about the Mexican Spanish on this side of the border, right? We know that the border over time has not always been, right? The Mexican frontier, Mexican-U.S. frontier was not always where it is. Mm-hmm. So in the dictionary or in other linguistic studies, has the Spanish of the Southwest of the United States, those dialectical regions, would like the Spanish spoken here have been seen as a continuation of what was spoken like in Monterrey and Chihuahua and El Paso, or historically has there been maybe a different region of what we could call Mexican Spanish here in the Southwest or in different parts of the Southwest in what is now the United States?
Well, in the 80s, each time the Mexican government has a problem, they look to the United States and they say, you are guilty. So in the 80s, there was an economical crisis in Mexico, and they founded a commission to the defense of Spanish. The target was American English. And they used to accuse precisely cities in the frontier as the main introducers of English words in Spanish. A friend of mine, who was the director of the Center of Studies at the Frontier in Tijuana, made a research. And he took Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez, then Acapulco, Mexico City. And he showed that there is much more influence of English in Acapulco and Mexico City than in Tijuana and Ciudad Juárez. And something more, in Tijuana and Ciudad Juárez, they are bilingual. And in Acapulco and Mexico City, we are not so bilingual. So it has nothing to do with geography. It has to do with the kind of living we are making.
I have a question. I wanted to ask a little bit more on the indigenous languages. You mentioned after the independence, Spanish became the national language, and now, even though it's a national language, now more people that had an indigenous language are owning it, so to speak. But is it being incorporated into like education, or how are they trying to bring back their dialects, if any, or are they being supported by the government, like a bilingual education or books in a native tongue that is not Spanish?
I don't know if I understood you well.
Se lo pregunto en español, porque tampoco me entendí. Es que sí está viendo un poco de la gente indígena utilizando sus idiomas como, digamos, el náhuatl o otomí, o así en el sistema educativo para enseñarle, inculcarle a las generaciones que vienen como forma de pues aceptar sus raíces y
yes. No, this is a very difficult problem in Mexico, mainly because of the intervention of governments. Precisely because of this indigenistic ideology, they are always impulsing to speak about the respect to American Indian languages, American Indian people, and so on. But this is only on the surface, because in fact, they do not pay attention to these people. When those who pay attention to these people are small groups of linguists, churches, and so on, who try to collaborate with them in order, first of all, to introduce writing in the Amerindian language, and then education in Amerindian language. I only know a case in which it was successful. In some towns around the Pátzcuaro Lake in Michoacán, where a group of teachers of Purépecha inheritance and linguists were together to organize organization from the kindergarten to the university, bilingual in Purépecha and Spanish. This was a success. Those boys now study at the university in Spanish, but they can use the language for all situations. But this is an exception. And I repeat, the problem is with the governments, because the governments always use Indians to show our ideology, but they do not pay attention to them.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lara. And now is the turn for the second lecture today, is entitled With No Regrets, Literature and Political Crisis. It's going to be presented by the distinguished literary critic Christopher Dominguez-Michael. And he's one of the most prominent literary critics in the Hispanic world. He has authored numerous critical works and biographies, including those of Fray Servando Teresa de Mier and Octavio Paz. His insightful analysis of literature and its intersection with political crisis have earned him international acclaim. So thank you very much also, Christopher, for coming here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Many times ago, I lost my battle to speaking good English in my conference and lectures, and I prefer to speak in Spanish. I'm sorry. En el mundo hispanohablante, una expresión anglosajona como public intellectual es del todo redundante. Yo he insistido en varias ocasiones en que el intelectual, desde que se empezó a utilizar la palabra de manera peyorativa en el affaire de Dreyfus, en la Francia de fines del siglo XIX, el intelectual es intelectual porque es público. No hay intelectuales no públicos. Puede haber pintores, poetas, cineastas que no hagan vida pública, pero el hecho de ser intelectual en la historia de las ideas del siglo XIX y XX nos hace públicos. Entonces yo voy a hablar de los cruces, más que entre la literatura y la política en momentos de crisis, de el conflicto entre el intelectual, sobre todo el escritor, que es lo que más conozco, y la política en 4 casos, uno de ellos francés y 3 más mexicanos. Como ustedes saben, en 1871 se produjo en Francia la Comuna de París, una rebelión popular que era el resultado del hundimiento del Segundo Imperio de Napoleón III, que había sido capturado por los prusianos, y fue la toma de París por sus ciudadanos, dada la incapacidad del Imperio francés de proteger a la nación de los prusianos. Tan violenta fue la toma de París que el gobierno francés acabó pidiendo la ayuda del ejército prusiano que rodeó la ciudad. La Comuna de París es uno de los episodios más sangrientos de la historia europea y fue aplastada de una manera que anunciaba lo que iba a ser las guerras del siglo XX. Es decir, guerras en que la población civil se vuelve el principal objetivo militar. Lo más interesante y estremecedor del caso de la Comuna de París es que fueron los escritores franceses los más entusiastas propagandistas de la represión. Prácticamente no hay ningún nombre célebre de escritor francés que no haya aplaudido el asesinato no solo de los trabajadores sublevados, sino de ancianos, niños, mujeres. Hay escenas verdaderamente dantescas en que las señoras de la burguesía que reconquistaban la ciudad le sacaban los ojos con paraguas a los moribundos. Y una generación entera de escritores franceses, estuvo ahí Flaubert, estuvieron los hermanos Goncourt, el poeta simbolista Catulle Mendès y muchos otros, veían esto como un espectáculo estético. Veían algo que fue muy cultivado por los totalitarismos del siglo XX, en la extrema violencia, una realización de la belleza. El poeta Théophile Gautier incluso escribió una elegía de la destrucción de París incendiado. Ciertamente los comuneros ejercieron un virulento vandalismo contra los monumentos históricos franceses. Fue derrumbada la estatua de Napoleón, bombardeado, incendiado el Louvre, y parecía que la gran ciudad, capital del siglo XIX, como la llamó Walter Benjamin, había sido destruida como consecuencia de las contradicciones que para algunos eran curiosamente el fin, cuando era en realidad el comienzo del capitalismo y un momento del nacimiento del carácter belicoso de la sociedad europea. Esta confusión que hizo de la violencia una de las formas de la estética invadirá todo el siglo XIX, y México no fue un país ajeno a este cruce entre los escritores y la política. Contra lo que se cree, a lo largo del siglo XX, los escritores siempre estuvieron detrás de las peores causas, creyendo siempre que estaban a favor de las mejores. La Revolución Mexicana fue interrumpida brutalmente en febrero de 1913 por el cuartelazo, golpe de Estado, de Victoriano Huerta. Previamente, el presidente derrocado y asesinado Francisco I. Madero fue despedazado desde la prensa por los intelectuales mexicanos. Poetas como José Juan Tablada o Salvador Díaz Mirón, siguiendo de manera deliberada el ejemplo de sus admirados franceses, crearon las condiciones para que Madero fuera asesinado. Y si uno lee el diario de José Juan Tablada, que vivía en Coyoacán, que ahora es el centro exacto de la Ciudad de México, pero entonces quedaba muy al sur, hay una verdadera júbilo por el derrocamiento de Madero y su asesinato, al grado que, como Tablada vivió hasta 1945, él tuvo que retirar esa edición de circulación y sustituirla por una versión un poco menos penosa de los hechos. Bueno, una interpretación posible tanto de la Comuna de París como del México en 1913 es que el siglo XIX hizo creer a los intelectuales que el Estado, y aquí tuvo mucho que ver la lectura de Hegel, que el Estado era una obra de arte de la civilización. y que su destrucción no era la negación de la obra de arte, sino su culminación. Hace 25 años vivimos algo muy similar. Otro intelectual francés, Jean Baudrillard, festejó el ataque contra las Torres Gemelas el 11 de septiembre de 2001 como una obra de arte, como una instalación. Entonces, esta estetización de la política, como la llamó Walter Benjamin justamente, es una de las partes más incómodas de analizar de la historia intelectual del siglo pasado y antepasado. Ahora tenemos esas dos cosas, el festejo de los intelectuales ante la violencia ejercida por el Estado. Hay también el otro festejo de los intelectuales festejando la violencia contra los grandes estados, las dictaduras, por razones bastante similares, pero vienen de otra fuente de la que no me voy a ocupar ahora, que es la tradición que va de los jacobinos a los marxistas, pasando por los leninistas. Pero esto nos lleva a las dos primeras grandes revoluciones del siglo XX, la mexicana y la rusa. Curiosamente, la literatura, sobre todo la novela, que es el género propio del siglo XIX, es bastante lenta en registrar los acontecimientos históricos. La invasión de Napoleón Bonaparte de Rusia es en 1812, pero el gran libro sobre esta guerra sale 40 años después, que es Guerra y Paz de Tolstoy. Como si la literatura necesitara de un tiempo sobre todo la novela, la prosa, necesitara de un tiempo de digestión. El poeta polaco Czesław Miłosz dice que el siglo XX se caracterizó por la aceleración de la historia. Todo ocurre más rápido y de manera más violenta. Si esta tesis es cierta, la Revolución Mexicana fue el primer caso, antes que la rusa, de una gran novela que se hizo sobre las rodillas en medio de la Revolución. Me refiero desde luego a Los de Abajo de Mariano Azuela. Esta novela apareció aquí abajito en El Paso, Paso, Texas, en 1915, en una primera versión. Salió en un periódico, pasó inadvertida, pero 10 años después, ya que salió en forma de libro, se vio con asombro que un joven médico me parece que de Lagos de Moreno, Jalisco, Mariano Azuela, había logrado entender lo que era la Revolución Mexicana. Este entendimiento pasaba por la idea de catástrofe incomprensible, es decir, no era exactamente un entendimiento. Él es el primero que pone en blanco sobre negro la palabra la bola, es decir, la revolución como algo que gira y se va llevando vidas, que empieza pequeñita y termina siendo un globo que se lleva todo encima. Para entender lo que fue Los de Abajo, hay que ver que el final de la novela en 1915 es modificado 10 años después, en 1925, por Azuela. El héroe de la novela es desde luego un campesino revolucionario que al final de la primera versión simplemente cae derrotado. En la segunda versión ya Azuela introduce una frase que no recuerdo exactamente cuál es, pero que dice algo así como: tanta sangre, tanto sacrificio fue inútil. Entonces la novela de la Revolución Mexicana, que el régimen del PRI hizo una de las columnas de la cultura oficial, desde el principio fue una novela contrarrevolucionaria. Si uno lee a Azuela, si uno lee a José Vasconcelos, que no escribió propiamente una novela, sino sus memorias, pues él consideraba como Azuela que la revolución había fracasado. En el caso de Vasconcelos, el fracaso de la revolución tenía que ver con la egomanía. Más bien la revolución había fracasado, según él, porque no había sido electo presidente de México en 1929. Pero su visión de la revolución es muy negativa. Como también lo es la de Martín Luis Guzmán. La sombra del caudillo sale en 1929 y pues retrata la Revolución Mexicana un poco siguiendo a Suetonio y la vida de los 12 Césares como una sucesión de generales astutos y asesinos, donde para Guzmán, como para toda su generación, que es la de Alfonso Reyes y Vasconcelos, el pueblo era una entidad muy remota. Ellos querían un cambio generacional entre Porfirio Díaz y Madero, pacífico, que les diera a ellos el poder porque les tocaba por edad, y al no producirte esto, se van del lado de los llamados ejércitos campesinos, pero sin mayor consideración al programa social de la Revolución Mexicana, que empieza a ser difundido por los intelectuales cardenistas en los años 30, pero que no era una de las grandes preocupaciones de la generación anterior. Entonces, las novelas de la Revolución Mexicana tienen esta primicia, que es Los de Abajo, de Mariano Azuela, y en Rusia pasa algo similar. La primera gran novela sobre la Revolución Rusa es El año desnudo, de Boris Pilniak, que aparece en 1919, y que es una visión catastrófica de la revolución. Dice, la Revolución Rusa es una bruja que aúlla en la ventisca del invierno. O sea, Pilniak profetiza que la revolución desatará un holocausto. Y leer las novelas sobre la Revolución Rusa, exceptando aquellas que fueron escritas bajo el realismo socialista, que eran propaganda escasamente literaria a favor del régimen stalinista, pues es una galería de terror. También son novelas antirrevolucionarias. Algunas de ellas conceden que el impulso generalmente siempre se concede que el impulso de toda revolución es noble, y generalmente se concede que el resultado es catastrófico. Entonces, en el siglo XX, porque el tiempo se acelera, ya tenemos novelas que muy poco, en medio de los acontecimientos, la de Azuela en 1915, la de Pilniak en 1919, antes de la guerra civil y la intervención extranjera que hizo muy sangrienta el nacimiento del régimen bolchevique, ya tenemos escritores que dejan un testimonio novelesco. Y aquí quiero hacer una distinción. No estoy hablando de crónicas periodísticas, que las hay magníficas. Tanto Los de Abajo de Azuela como El año desnudo de Pilniak son verdaderas novelas. Es decir, el escritor está nutriéndose de la historia para imaginar. Y sus personajes son personajes que forman parte del mundo de la literatura, no de la vida. Entonces no hay que confundir, en ambas revoluciones hubo reportajes históricos, periodísticos extraordinarios, pero que no eran propiamente novelas. Si recorremos el siglo XX mexicano, llegamos al movimiento estudiantil de 1968, que se produce ya habiendo en México una generación de escritores, más o menos la generación nacida en 1932, que tenía una alta conciencia estética y una alta conciencia de la autonomía del acto artístico en relación a la política. Ellos, tanto en la pintura como en la literatura, habían rechazado de manera radical los mitos del nacionalismo revolucionario y habían decidido que México necesitaba una literatura plenamente moderna donde el adoctrinamiento político quedara fuera. Bueno, esta generación era la menos indicada para enfrentarse a algo tan sorpresivo, porque lo fue, como el movimiento estudiantil del 68, que como ustedes saben empieza por ser una pelea callejera de unos estudiantes y se convierte en un movimiento democrático en semanas, que expresaba desde luego el hartazgo de la parte más ilustrada de la clase media mexicana ante varias décadas de autoritarismo. Autoritarismo que, ahora que ha pasado el tiempo, uno ve con ojos más benignos, porque le dio a México una modernidad, un armado de instituciones y una paz social que notable en comparación a lo que fue el siglo XX para los países de América del Sur. Entonces, la asignatura pendiente de la Revolución Mexicana, como lo dijo Daniel Cosío Villegas, como lo dijo José Revueltas desde fines de los años 40, era la democracia. Y el movimiento estudiantil del 68 fue democrático. Democrático en un sentido muy distinto a lo que era México hace 2 semanas. El movimiento estudiantil del 68, si ustedes revisan el pliego petitorio, no tocaba el asunto electoral. Todavía no se consideraba que la sustitución cíclica de autoridades por el voto popular fuera la médula de la democracia. Se pedían cosas bastante más simples: la destitución de jefes policíacos abusivos, la libertad de expresión, la liberación de presos políticos, etcétera. Bueno, esta generación donde está Salvador Elizondo, Juan García Ponce, Inés Arredondo, Elena Garro, de pronto se vio enfrentada al movimiento, de cara al movimiento estudiantil. Todos ellos, con la excepción de Elena Garro, lo apoyaron de manera firme, salieron a marchar. El movimiento fue, como se sabe, reprimido el 2 de octubre en la Plaza de las Tres Culturas, y durante los siguientes años la pregunta es: ¿cuándo viene la novela del 68? Es decir, ¿cuándo los mexicanos vamos a tener nuestra guerra y paz, o nuestro año desnudo, o los de abajo? Y pues seguimos esperando esa novela. ¿Por qué? No lo sé. Tal parece que la historia del siglo XX se empezó a resistir a esas visiones globales que capturaban en un solo libro a una sociedad entera, y que ya no era tan fácil escribir como se había hecho con la invasión napoleónica de Rusia, o como lo había hecho Flaubert con la educación sentimental a mediados del siglo XIX. Ya no era tan fácil que un libro sustituyera la complejidad de un fenómeno histórico. Y sí, se murió toda una generación sin escribir la novela del 68. Eso no quiere decir que no haya capítulos sobre el 68. Lo hay uno estupendo en Palinuro de México, de Fernando del Paso. Lo hay otro estupendo en Crónica de la Intervención de Juan García Ponce, pero se parte de la base de que son fragmentos de vida. Hay una excepción notable, que es el Apando de José Revueltas. Como ustedes saben, José Revueltas era una generación anterior, había nacido en 1914 como Octavio Paz y Efraín Huerta, y va a dar a la cárcel como parte de los dirigentes de alguna manera del movimiento estudiantil, y en la cárcel de Lecumberri escribe una novela breve, asombrosa, una de las mejores novelas escritas en México, que es El Apando. Dicen que Borges decía que el Corán era árabe porque no había un solo camello. ya se leyeron el Corán y sí, sí hay camellos, pero bueno, la frase es buena. Y ha quedado por default que, ahí sí es fácil comprobarlo porque la novela es pequeña, que el Apando es la novela del 68 porque no lo menciona. Pero todos quienes lo leyeron sabían que el autor estaba preso en Lecumberri por haber participado en el movimiento estudiantil. Al grado que a la hora en que fueron juzgados por la justicia mexicana, Revueltas decidió declararse autor intelectual del movimiento en un gesto que ha sido interpretado como egolátrico o egomaníaco, pero era una manera de una argucia jurídica inocente para rebajar la pena de los otros presos, que eran más jóvenes. Entonces, 68 se queda sin su novela. Entonces tenemos que la Comuna de París tuvo a los escritores ardientes defensores de la represión, lo mismo en el cuartelazo de Madero en 1913, pero ya en 68 a la novela no le alcanza para reflejar todo el fenómeno, como se había ocurrido con la Revolución Mexicana y la Revolución Rusa. Finalmente, una cosa, y con esto voy a terminar, que me llama mucho la atención, es que el último trastorno social importante en la vida mexicana, la rebelión neozapatista de 1994, pese a que su dirigente, el llamado subcomandante Marcos, fue un profuso emisor de comunicados, algunos muy simpáticos y hasta de alta calidad literaria, según Octavio Paz, parece que la actividad literaria o periodística de Marcos inhibió a los escritores que apoyaban al zapatismo, porque no hay una novela importante sobre la revuelta, y solo algunos poetas, la mayoría comprometidos con el zapatismo, han dejado poemas al respecto. Pero en la historia literaria moderna de México hay una ausencia interesante, que es la del 94 y la literatura, donde desde luego hubo una cobertura periodística y de crónicas extraordinaria, pero no tanto por su calidad, sino por su dimensión, pero no hubo ficción y no hubo poesía. Ahora, todavía puede haberla, porque si pasaron 40 años entre la invasión de Rusia y la Guerra y Paz de Tolstoy, pueden pasar algunas décadas antes de que alguien de otra generación que no haya vivido el fin del siglo XX en México escriba este libro. Y así nos quitaríamos un poco el peso que sentían los escritores que vivieron el 68, de que pasaban los años, los días y los años, como se tituló el diario de prisión de Lecumberri, de Luis González de Alba, quitarse esa presión de tener que escribir esa novela sobre el 68 que nunca llegó. Todos los intelectuales a lo largo del último siglo y medio se han sentido obligados a ser quienes registran la actividad sismográfica de la historia y se han sentido comprometidos a participar en la política revolucionaria o contrarrevolucionaria de una manera activa, con esa idea de que el intelectual es el que tiene las mejores soluciones para el acertijo de la historia, idea que ha resultado nefasta, contraproducente, y que llevó durante la última parte, ese periodo de falsa paz que hubo entre la caída del muro de Berlín y el ataque a las Torres Gemelas, pues el consenso es que a los intelectuales deberían encerrarnos en los cubículos universitarios y ya no permitirnos hablar de política, porque nuestras conversaciones sobre política habían llevado al nazismo y al comunismo. Desgraciadamente, la emergencia del terror islámico y la política identitaria y los nacionalismos virulentos el populismo han vuelto a volver indispensable para bien y para mal que los intelectuales y los escritores participemos en la vía pública. Pero yo mismo hacia el año 2000 pensaba que a mí ya eso ya no me iba a tocar. Entonces, en los momentos de crisis política, la literatura siempre tiene algo, siempre quiere decir algo, pero no siempre puede. Y yo, como estoy en contra de los determinismos, no me atrevería a, con los ejemplos que les he dado, establecer una legalidad, es decir, un conjunto de leyes, sino me concreto a estos casos. A veces sí, la historia tiene un libro decisivo, como los de abajo de Azuela, o como ese no libro sobre el 68, que es El Apando de José Revueltas, y a veces este libro no aparece, como ocurre después de la rebelión de los neozapatistas en 1994. Esta es mi intervención y antes de terminar, bueno, quiero agradecer la muy cálida hospitalidad de todos ustedes aquí en San Antonio, agradecer la invitación y decirles que da la casualidad que la primera conferencia sobre literatura mexicana que yo di fuera de México fue en San Antonio, Texas, hace 35 años. Entonces este es para mí un día conmemorativo. Le doy las gracias al doctor Sergio Alcocer por la invitación y a todo el equipo que ha sido tan generoso conmigo y con el doctor Luis Fernando Lara, miembros del Colegio Nacional, y creo que queda un poco de tiempo por si hay preguntas de ustedes o comentarios. Gracias.
Thank you, Professor Dominguez, for this thought-provoking lecture. Appreciate that. So we're going to proceed with a very short Q&A session. So raise your hand, please, if you have questions. And before that, I would like to give an amazing shout out to Professor Rushford for translating that. That was amazing. Thank you. Woo-hoo! All right, who has the first question? So I think I'm going this way. Sorry.
Muchas gracias por esta plática tan interesante y también por la otra plática que también estuvo muy interesante. Le quería preguntar su opinión sobre Pánico o Peligro de María Luisa Puga, que habla de Tlatelolco, pero no sé cómo ve esa novela en cuanto a...
Leí Pánico o Peligro de María Luisa Puga, como varios de sus libros hace muchísimos años. Y si yo te dijera ahorita algo sería inexacto, la verdad no, tendría que releerla para darte una respuesta competente.
Sí, gracias. Bueno, gracias.
Muchas gracias por la plática, muy interesante, y lo que yo quiero saber es ¿dónde puedo conseguir una lista de todas las novelas y todos los trabajos que mencionó usted?
Pues tanto como una lista, no sé si la haya, pero entrando en el terreno de la autopromoción, yo tengo un libro que se llama Tiros en el Concierto, literatura mexicana del siglo V, quinto porque es el quinto siglo de la lengua española en México, el siglo XX, y ahí abordo estos temas, particularmente el caso de Martín Luis Guzmán y de José Revueltas.
Ok, muchas gracias.
Gracias. One last question before we wrap it up. Thank you.
Sí, gracias por compartir. Cuando yo estudié literatura latinoamericana en los 90, bueno, en el 98 más o menos, ninguno de mis profesores habló sobre la literatura mexicana. se me hace muy interesante porque ahorita que estaba escribiendo me puse a pensar en todas las otras obras de otros países en América Latina. Y nunca nos
te dieron clases de literatura latinoamericana sin hablar de México.
Exactamente. Entonces dije, wow, porque pues así que Gabriel García Márquez y bueno, otros, ¿verdad? Isabel Allende, etcétera, etcétera. Y ahorita que estaba escuchando, dije, wow, gracias por compartir.
Bueno, yo creo que las dos grandes literaturas de América Latina son la argentina y la mexicana, sin ninguna duda. Quizás los argentinos sean mejores narradores y los mexicanos mejores poetas, pero sin estos dos, sin la Ciudad de México y sin Buenos Aires, no se entiende la literatura en lengua española desde fines del siglo XIX.
Ok, gracias.
Gracias. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now reached the conclusion of the first lecture series for the evening. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you. We would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Lara and Professor Dominguez. And on behalf of UTSA, please join me, Dr. Montoya, Professor Lara, Professor Alcocer, to the stage. We would like to present you with a token of our appreciation. Thank you for being here. The token, all righty. Thank you. Yes, pictures with Adriana, please smile for the camera. Beautiful, thank you. And then before we wrap up, I have a special announcement for those of you who are looking for seeking extra credit. Please scan the QR code in here. And I also would like to invite everybody to join us outside to this auditorium for a reception. This is a wonderful opportunity for networking with and discuss the lecture with our wonderful guests. Thank you all for attending. Oh, do you want to?
And before you all get up, we have an amazing team in Global Initiatives who've put that together, as you can see here, led by Carely de la Garza. And so I just want to take a moment to thank Carely and Melanie and the whole team for putting this together.
Thank you, Dr. M. And thank you all for attending. I think that's a cue for mariachi. Thank you for joining us today. We are looking forward to seeing you in the future events. Wonderful. I'm not blind. It's glasses for an artist. That's why. gracias. Bueno, como buena callejoneada no puede faltar, buena tradición mexicana, vamos a seguir al mariachi a la recepción. Los invito a todos a pasar aquí al lado. Please join us for the reception. Thank you everybody for coming and see you in a little bit. Thank you so much.